the fall of Bashar al-Assad and said, Robert, you've met Shara a couple of times. What do you think?
روبرت فورد السفير الأميركي الأسبق لدى سوريا والجزائر.
You will remember from the Obama administration, it was me who led the effort to put him on the terrorism.
But was that the real goal after your experience in Iraq?
Stop picking on our Iraqis. This unit in Abu Ghraib committed this atrocity. I said, but then you don't use the word red line, ever. And I said, and frankly, you don't tell another head of state to step aside. When I was invited to go there, I was at first very reluctant. I didn't want to be in an orange suit, let's be honest. Saraha raha.
In your tenure in Iraq, did the name Abu Muhammad al-Jolani ring a bell back then? Ambassador Robert Ford, thank you for having us and welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Your long career as a U.S. diplomat, deputy ambassador in Iraq and ambassador in Syria and also in Algeria, deputy ambassador in Bahrain, several other states, will help us in this talk to try to assess what are the real drivers of U.S. policy to the region between the declared goals and the hard interests. And we'll definitely, through this interview, pass through your latest comments about your meeting with the Syrian president now, Ahmed al-Shara, before his ascension to presidency and after it, and the response that comment got from the US, from the Syrian presidency. But I'd like to begin from the initial moment of that change, maybe the US policy towards the Middle East, which is post 9/11, 2001, and specifically the invasion of Iraq. What do you think was the precursor of that invasion? The declared goals were the destruction of the weapon of mass destruction and the spread of democracy and liberty. But was that the real goal after your experience in Iraq?
It was the real goal. It was the real goal. The problem was there was no plan to do it. It was the real goal in the sense that Washington, the George W. Bush administration, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell to an extent, and of course President Bush himself, they all were afraid that sooner or later Saddam Hussein would have weapons of mass destruction. And it's important to note that he did use chemical weapons against Kurdish communities in northern Iraq. And there was a terrible attack on a Kurdish town called Halabja. And so he had a record, he had a history of using WMD. And the Bush administration, rightly or wrongly, believed that someday Saddam Hussein would give these weapons to a terrorist group. And the terrorist group would use them in the United States. Remember the mentality after 9/11. So they invaded Iraq, not because they thought Saddam Hussein would attack America the next day or attack America the next month, but they were afraid sooner or later Saddam Hussein would be involved with a terrorist group in an attack on the United States, like 9/11, but with chemical or weapons or maybe nuclear weapons or something like that. And they thought the solution to the Iraq problem would be to build a democracy in Iraq. And they thought, this is the Bush administration, they thought that if there was more democracy in Middle East states in general, across the region, that the region would be more stable. Their analysis was that one of the reasons al-Qaeda had supporters was that people in Arab states were angry at the political repression in those states. And so if there was a democracy in Iraq, it would be a model for the region more broadly. That's the mentality of the George W. Bush administration. It's a long time ago, huh? It's
Yeah,
21 years ago.
Sure. But it was perplexing a little bit because the motives shifted through and through as if the US wanted the war and was trying to search for the right reason to do it. Because at the beginning, we remember that they said that there were links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And then it shifted to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and then there were no nuclear weapons. So that's why one would think that the need to declare a war preceded the reason for it.
Right. So it's important to remember that Saddam Hussein did have chemical weapons at one time. And I mentioned the fighting against the Kurds in northern Iraq and the attack on Halebja. And no one questions that there were chemical weapons used in Halebja. There's a museum in Halebja. You can learn quite a bit about the attack. So it's a different question if Saddam Hussein had supplies of chemical weapons in 2002 and 2003. And what we have learned from Iraqis after the invasion is that Saddam Hussein didn't have reserves, supplies of chemical weapons ready in 2002, 2003, but the possibility of having chemical weapons Saddam Hussein used to deter not the United States, but to deter Iran, which was also an enemy of Baghdad at that time. So, but the Americans didn't understand any of that. There was pressure from the White House on the American intelligence community to take an analytical position which emphasized the risk of eventual Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. So we had strange reports about things like tubes, aluminum tubes that Colin Powell talked about at the Security Council, all of which, I mean, there were tubes. Nobody questions that there were tubes, but the tubes were not for a chemical weapons program or a biological weapons program. They're tubes because they had some other construction purpose. So, but the Bush administration was not willing to take any chances. They understood they had full military superiority, and so they decided to remove the Saddam Hussein government and remove any chance that Iraq might one day in the future help a terrorist group attack the United States.
So you think it was within those frameworks, but not
absolutely
not what many people say about the real motives, be it the control of oil and oil routes in the region or the change of the geopolitical balance of power.
Oil had nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Prices of energy in 2003 were not particularly expensive. The American economy was growing very strongly. There wasn't a big problem with world oil supplies in 2003. And perhaps the best evidence is the Bush administration later, when the Iraqi government was issuing tenders, bids for development of oil fields in Iraq, the Bush administration did not put pressure on the Iraqi government to award all the contracts to American companies. Instead, you saw companies from China, adversary of the United States, Russia, bigger adversary of the United States at that time, France, Britain, Shell Oil, Britain, Total, all get contracts too. I think ExxonMobil got one and Chevron got one, but other companies got most of the contracts. So,
at the beginning, the reports about Halliburton and its link with Dick Cheney, you are saying that these are really magnified stories.
So, yeah, they're magnified, and Halliburton made much more money working with the American military on logistics.
So it's not. So what about the other question that if you take a look at the logical implication of that vote, Iraq at that time was like a buffer state from Iranian influence reaching the whole Middle East. Then the US comes in, the state collapses, the army collapses, and now Iran is a player in Iraq and the whole region.
Right. I was in a meeting once with the former king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, Allah yarhamu, who said to me and the other American official in the room, the American ambassador in Iraq, Zalmay Khalilzad, he said, "You have given Iraq to the Iranians on a golden plate." And I understand his point, but it's important to understand that the Americans, Washington, did not expect that the entire government would collapse in Baghdad and in the provinces. They did not expect the chaos that came when Saddam Hussein and his regime fell. They thought, this was the American thinking in the White House and in the Pentagon, that Saddam would go, maybe the ministers in each ministry would go. So the Interior Ministry goes, the Defense Minister goes, the Justice Minister goes, the Oil Minister goes. But the administration, the Muwazzafin, would stay. And so all the Americans would need to do is appoint a new Minister of Energy, or appoint a new Minister of Justice, or appoint a new Minister for Agriculture, and everything would be fine. That's what the Americans expected in 2003. And they were not prepared when the government completely collapsed and citizens of Iraq attacked the different buildings and looted them and destroyed them. The Americans were very surprised. And maybe some of your viewers will remember that the American Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said, well, it's too bad about looting, but that's democracy. And the remark is ridiculous, but it shows the mentality that the top people had, that they did not understand the situation in Iraq.
But didn't the U.S. Policy towards Iraq help reach that endpoint?
Of course.
With the de-Baathification and breaking down the army?
Well, I would even go farther than that. I would say the American sanctions on Iraq before the war had had a terrible, damaging impact on Iraqi society, on the Iraqi government. The poverty which I saw in Iraq in 2003 was shocking. It was worse than the poverty I saw in Said Masr in Upper Egypt in the 1980s. It was worse. It's unbelievable. So that had an impact. And then when the American temporary administration, the Coalition Provisional Authority under Paul Bremer, when it decided to pursue a program of de-Baathification, which was not an American idea. That idea came from Iraqi political parties, in particular among the Shia Islamists and the Kurds. When the Americans disbanded the Iraqi army, again, an idea that was not an original American idea. It came from some of the Iraqi opposition parties who had returned to Iraq from abroad. When the Americans did these things without consulting a wider group of Iraqis, and then were surprised by the results, of course it helped harm Iraq. There's no question.
But then the question would be, why didn't the U.S. consult a wider base of the Iraqis, and why did they listen to specific groups, as if the U.S. policy towards Iraq was directed by groups in Iraq, not by the U.S. administration itself?
But it was. That's what I'm saying. Those groups had huge influence in Iraq. So we're talking about people like Ahmed Chalabi. And of course, they had long connections with Washington policymakers, especially Republican Party politicians. So, but not only, also Democrats, we have to be honest. So why didn't they listen to a wider group? I think two reasons. Number one, they didn't have so many people, civilians working in Baghdad in May, June, July of 2003. They were small teams. The team working on political issues under Paul Bremer when I arrived in Iraq in August of 2003 was about 10 people. for the whole country. Very few. I think there was one British diplomat helping them with the coalition who spoke Arabic. The Americans didn't speak Arabic. So, of course, the Americans either depended on a translator who usually came from one of the political parties, the Iraqi political parties, and so had his agenda, or the Americans spoke to Iraqi political figures who spoke English, and almost all of them had lived outside of Iraq for 20 years. And so they too had an agenda that was different from the agenda of Iraqis who had lived in the country for a long time. Why is Muqtada Sadr so popular compared to these Iraqis who lived abroad? Because Muqtada Sadr stayed in Iraq and suffered through the sanctions, through all of the miseries of the Saddam Hussein period, like regular Iraqis.
In your tenure in Iraq, which lasted from 2003 till 2010, with a small break in the middle.
I had a little vacation as ambassador to Algeria. Yeah.
Yep.
Short vacation, year and a half.
How did you see the progression of U.S. policy towards Iraq when, with each step, they were facing more challenges and the whole ideals of democracy and stability was withering away? And where do you pinpoint the missed opportunity?
So there were many missed opportunities, not just one, there were many. But the general progression was the Americans were slow to understand that they were facing a crisis in Iraq, a crisis that was becoming more violent and was becoming a war. I was in a meeting in October 2003 with Paul Bremer in Baghdad, where all of the civilians working in the different provinces of Iraq, the different governorates, we all came together for a strategy meeting. And I said to Paul Bremer, we need to have employment programs for the young Iraqis because there are no jobs, and we are now starting to see demonstrations among a community which in general was happy the Americans came. The Shia of Najaf, where I was working, the province of Najaf, were generally pro-American in early 2003 because Saddam Hussein had been so cruel to that community. I said, we need a jobs program to give young people hope, just for a couple of years, just a jobs program. And my colleague, who was an American diplomat, Keith Milnes, was working in Anbar. And he said, yes, we have the same problem in Anbar. We are having young people and they're drifting into violent groups. We need job programs to give them hope. So you had Najaf, the American, and Anbar, the American, saying to Bremer, we need a jobs program. Do you know what Paul Bremer said to us? He said, I did not come here to set up a socialist government in Iraq. We are not going to create jobs programs. And I said to him, Ambassador Bremer, with all due respect, we are going to have a war. We're in a war. First, we have to win the war. Then we'll worry about the specificities of economics in Iraq. But first, we have to win a war. He said, absolutely not.
So it was relying on trickle-down economics.
So what we had in Anbar by November, December, we had a full-scale muqawama, we had full-scale resistance, and in Najaf, we had the Jaysh al-Mahdi become much stronger. So what I'm trying to explain is this is the mentality that the Americans came with. Now, fast forward 2004, 2005, it's clear the war is much worse. The American attention shifts away from pure democracy and pure human rights and pure capitalist economy. Finally, they understand they have to win the war. So the mentality has changed. But what that means is they're helping the Iraqi government with its security forces. But the security forces of the Iraqi government were infiltrated by, let's be honest, Shia Islamist militias, who again had a separate agenda, which was not a pure security agenda. It was a security for some and an insecurity for others agenda. And so I was then the top political advisor at the American embassy. We would take my office. I had a big team. I had 20 American diplomats working with me. We would take instances of human rights abuses, take them to the American military that was training these security forces, these Iraqi security forces. I'd say, this unit in Abu Ghraib committed this atrocity. This unit, this Iraqi unit, committed this atrocity, and they're working with these American soldiers. And we have this problem over here in Mosul. The senior American military general, who later became chief of staff in the American Armed Forces, the number one top job, but that was after Iraq, said to me, stop picking on our Iraqis. Stop persecuting our Iraqis. And I said, they're not our Iraqis. We're the Americans. I said, we have to fix these human rights abuses. And he said, you are causing problems for the Iraqi security forces. What could I say to you?
So the U.S. was now
what we had,
taking sides
we were taking sides. We were taking sides on behalf of the Iraqi government, despite what it was doing to opposition to the Iraqi government, whether it be civilians in Anbar, or civilians in Baghdad, or civilians in Basra. We were absolutely taking sides. We were saying it doesn't matter.
When did Iran begin to maybe impact some of the Shiites that you said at the beginning?
From the beginning.
Americans?
From the very beginning, from 2003. Even before, there were Iranian militias, like the Badr Corps, who had very close ties to the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps. We knew that. But it did not stop us from allowing them to enter the Iraqi government. In 2005, after the first election with the ink on the fingers, January 2005, which was for Iraqis, for many Iraqis, a genuinely happy occasion. It gives them hope. People need hope. But then the winners of that election, who were primarily a Shia Islamist coalition and Kurdish parties up from Suleimaniya and Erbil, Dohuk, they were assembling a cabinet. The negotiations were very difficult, but they were making progress, and they had a candidate for interior minister. And this person for the interior minister, who had worked with the Americans on training Iraqi forces and coordinating security with American forces, he was going to be from a Shia Islamist party closely tied to the Falak Badr, closely tied to the Badr Corps. My political office at the embassy said to the White House, if this happens, if he is appointed, we will have thorough militia penetration of the Iraqi police and the Iraqi Interior Ministry. So we need to say to the Iraqis, we cannot work with that man. Pick a different man. This man we cannot work with. The response from George Bush, not one time, but 2 times, was stay out of it. The first time he said stay out of it, we appealed. And we sent a special message. I remember writing the message directly to the president saying, Mr. President, if this happens, it will cause us big problems almost immediately with other communities in Iraq. We must object to this particular person. And the answer came a second time, stay out of it. So we watched it.
Why? Why do you think?
I think George Bush believed that because of the elections, Iraqis had suddenly become Democrats instead of Iraqis still having their old traditional political culture.
Do you think that one of the reasons that thinking that the Iraqis, because you topple Saddam Hussein, would welcome the Americans was a little bit illogical at least, because one, in the U.S. administration, wouldn't he think that, okay, but these people would see the Americans as invaders, as occupiers, and thus Iran or other countries can try to ally itself with them to remove the occupier.
I think in 2003 they didn't think that way. But by 2005, they did understand that. They did. And so they were in a hurry to build an Iraqi government that would be strong and able to control security without American soldiers. Very definitely they understood. So the Americans were always in a hurry. Just to give you an example, Judd, the election in January 2005, we knew that the Sunni community, the Sunni Arab community in places like West Baghdad, Anbar, Nineveh, Mosul, Salahuddin, we knew they would not vote. I mean, they were boycotting. And there was, to be fair to the populations there was a threat of terrorist attack against polling stations. The security was not good. And the embassy again suggested, let's delay the elections from January to March or April. Maybe the security will be better. And then the Sunnah can vote along with the Kurds and the Shia. If we don't, and we continue forward, the Sunnah representation in the parliament will be very weak. They will be excluded, and we will have more political problems. So it's better to delay the election until conditions allow the Sunnah to vote. George Bush said, no, we have a schedule. We are keeping to the schedule.
So that's what you call the calendar-driven agenda. That was the mistake.
That's one of the mistakes. Oh, there's so many. I mean, we could have a list of 100 mistakes here. I don't know how much time you have for the program. But
but the reason behind this calendar-driven agenda was, as you're saying, that the Americans knew by that point that this is a mess and we need to go pull out.
And partly that, but the mess would become a problem in American domestic politics for the Republican Party.
Definitely.
Which it did.
But the other side of that story is that if you leave Iraq in this kind of mess, the geopolitical changes would haunt you everywhere in the region.
The Americans, or the American thinking was, if we just pulled out the forces very quickly, the American troops, there were a lot of troops, there were 150,000 soldiers. If we just pull them out suddenly, Iraq will descend into a full civil war. Different countries, Gulf states, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, will all become involved more than they already are. They were already involved in some ways. Not so much the Gulf states. The Gulf states really were not that involved, but other countries were. And Syria, for example. And it will just create greater chaos. But even more than that, America would lose the war and American credibility would suffer. And so the American thinking is, if America takes a big loss in Iraq, what will happen to American interests in other parts of the Middle East? What will happen to American interests in Asia? What will happen to American interests in Europe? Especially with Russia at the time was weak, but we expected that it would become stronger again one day and that the competition with Russia could return.
We spoke a little bit earlier about some of the rationales behind the real motives of this war. Related to the one that I mentioned about making Iran closer to the region, I read back then, I remember reading in the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy magazines, some of the prominent names trying to theorize for this idea that this is a genius move because now the whole Gulf states would be fearful of Iran's expansion in the region, and thus they would buy American weapons and be more and more reliant on the American to defend them from any possible future war.
That was not the thinking in the Iraq policy, I don't think. I never heard that this was a clever plan the Americans had to make the Americans more important for the Gulf states. Number one, we already were important for the Gulf states. We had an American Navy base in Bahrain. We had an American base in Qatar. We had American bases in Abu Dhabi. Later, the base in Qatar became El Udeid, which is now a huge American base. We had an American base in Kuwait dating to the 1991 war. So it's not like we didn't have a security relationship with the Gulf already. We had a very close security relationship with the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia as well. I think the Americans expected that Baghdad would be a new, strong government that would be able to push back against Iranian expansionism at the top of the Gulf, and that the model of democracy in Iraq would cause problems in Iran, which has its own unhappy population.
You mentioned once that one of your frustrations in your tenure in Iraq was the U.S. not backing the Sahawat, the awakenings, when they were fighting Al-Qaeda, or backing down.
Or leaving them, abandoning them.
Why do you think that decision was taken?
The Americans abandoned the Sahwa because Washington wanted to get out of the Iraq War. The Obama administration wanted to take the troops out of Iraq. The American population here in the United States wanted to get out of Iraq. The war became very unpopular. Why did Barack Obama win the election in November of 2008? Because of the Iraq War. And we had also an economic crisis, but the Iraq War contributed to that crisis too. So the war was very unpopular, and Barack Obama promised to get American forces out. So much of Obama's policy in Iraq was driven by the need to get an Iraqi government that would be a partner in negotiating the withdrawal of all American forces out of Iraq. And in fact, in 2011, they did all leave Iraq.
And that's why they abandoned Sahwa and...
Right. They asked Nouri al-Maliki and his administration to give them jobs, to give them positions in the security forces, in particular in Sunni-dominated areas, and for them to not retaliate against members of the Sahwa who before had been involved in the Muqawama, and in some cases, Al-Qaeda. So, and Nouri al-Maliki broke all of those promises. But what's interesting is the Americans didn't complain hard against Maliki. They did complain. I mean, I was in meetings where we complained, but the complaints were not tough complaints. The complaints were shekli. They were formal complaints.
Speaking about Nouri al-Maliki, you are so avowedly clear about your position on the U.S. backing al-Maliki. First of all, why did you complain about that decision? What was your fear? And
the decision to back Maliki?
Yeah. And why at the same time the U.S. took that decision despite your grievances about it?
Yeah. So, as I said, the Obama administration priority was to withdraw the American forces. When Iraq had an election in 2010, two political forces, Iraqi political forces, emerged from the election almost equal. Nouri al-Maliki's rule of law and the Shia Islamist parties that were allied with it, and Ayad Alawi's National Alliance. Almost equal. Ayad Alawi had a few more seats in the parliament, but Maliki was still the prime minister until a new prime minister was named by the parliament, the Council of Representatives. The negotiations about a new cabinet, would it be under Ayad Alawi, would it be under Nouri al-Maliki? The negotiations went on and continued and continued and continued. The Obama administration in Washington was waiting for a government to be formed so they could negotiate the withdrawal. They were waiting and waiting. There was no end in sight. And the two blocs both were unable to name a prime minister. And the Americans watched for about 4 months, 5 months. Then Joe Biden, who was Obama's vice president, made the decision that the United States would back Nouri al-Maliki. And so, in particular, this mattered for the Kurdish factions from Suleimania and Erbil. The Americans urged Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani to back Nouri al-Maliki. And let's just say that both of those men, Barzani and Talabani, had a history with Nouri al-Maliki. They knew him better than the Americans did, frankly. And so they were reluctant. The Americans negotiated a deal between Maliki with the Kurdish leaders. And finally, in the end, Maliki became prime minister. I had 2 different meetings with Biden before I left Iraq in I left in March 2010 to go to Syria. I had 2 different meetings with Biden, and I said in both meetings, don't do this. This is a mistake.
Why?
Because Nouri al-Maliki was known to be very hard on the Sunni community in Iraq particularly, but also on dissidents inside other parts of Iraq, in places like Basra and Maysan and Najaf and other places. I mean, the relations were tense, difficult. And with the Kurds, the relations were very, very difficult. And I knew that from my time in Baghdad from 2004. I said, he will cause constant problems. And so it would be much better to let the Iraqis negotiate as long as they need to find a government. They'll find a compromise sooner or later. We, the Americans, need to stay out and be patient. Just let the Iraqis negotiate. But as I said, the Obama administration was in a hurry. So
To leave.
to negotiate to leave.
But because some people would ask some question about how come the United States backed Nouri al-Maliki, who's known for certain relations with Iran and some factions.
So
How
I
does
asked,
that happen?
yeah, so the answer to that question is, and I was out of Iraq by the time Biden made this decision. So I'm watching from Washington while I'm waiting to go to Damascus. But I had my contacts back at the American embassy in Baghdad, my friends, why are we doing this? It's a bad idea. And what they told me was, and one was a very top American official in Baghdad, said it will take too long to find an alternative to Maliki. It will take many more months. We do not have time for such a long negotiation. So our choice is either Maliki quickly or no one for a long time. So we'll take Maliki quickly. That was the analysis.
So in your opinion, the American policy towards Iraq was to the detriment of the country during
course.
the way in and the way out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even leaving, and you
Right.
cannot leave.
And then, of course, we have to go back in 2014.
Yep.
So the irony is that the hurry to leave Iraq in 2011 caused problems which later compelled us to return to Iraq. And we still now, in 2025, still have American soldiers in Iraq. Exactly what I think people like me in 2003 and 2004 did not want.
But some of the conspiracy theories say that that's why some people say that the U.S. was the reason behind the emergence of ISIS. Because when you leave the country through weak government and a weak army
So
with
what I
so
would
much grievances.
Yeah. So I would say first, the responsibility mainly is on those who were committing the violations which aggravated young people to join ISIS. And that wasn't so much American soldiers as Iraqi security forces. Let's be honest. Saraha raha. But were the Americans helping those people? Yes. Helping those people committing the violations? Absolutely. No question. No question.
But why? What's the incentive for the Americans to help someone to do some violation that would aggravate the situation?
Because the American calculation is, if we don't help them, the security is worse. The analysis is completely false. The analysis is completely mistaken, and yet we did it.
I know it's a hard question to answer, but I'll try.
But I would just say, people who think that the Americans know everything don't understand America. Often in America, there is a lack of information. The CIA does not know everything. The CIA knows everything in Hollywood movies. But in real life, the CIA's information is often very limited. There are bureaucratic interests. So if you have American military officers who are working with Iraqi security forces, they may even have friends. They may have loyalties to those Iraqi security forces, despite those security forces committing violations. We have the exact same situation now with the way many American military officers are close to the Syrian Democratic Forces in eastern Syria, despite the Syrian Democratic Forces committing extrajudicial killing, despite them kidnapping young people, including young women, to join the ranks of the YPG militia, despite the extortion that some of these YPG militia members undertake against Syrian families in eastern Syria, in places like Raqqa and Hasaka, etc. So that happens, and part of it is just a normal human relationship. That's why I don't like American soldiers in the Middle East to begin with, because we're out of our depth. We don't understand the culture. People do things and we don't understand why. So it's a broader discussion, Jed. But in any case, the American analysis about what was driving ISIS, I think, was mistaken. And the Americans ended up being involved in an Iraqi game, Nuri al-Maliki's game, of this is a good tribe and this is a bad tribe. And the dividing that Maliki did, the Americans were part of it. But let's be clear, it came originally from Nuri al-Maliki. It didn't come from Washington. I mean, who in Washington would know what a Bagara is? They wouldn't have you could ask 100 people in Washington, the national security establishment, they wouldn't know what a Bagara is. They just wouldn't know. A Jabor, they wouldn't know.
So we will now go along to your next tenure in Syria.
Yeah.
Which is a continuation in the story.
Continuation of failure.
But I will ask you a concluding question about this era. At the end, maybe we'll ask a couple of questions about how do you see the situation in Iraq. But to what extent does a diplomat affect U.S. policy after your tenure in Iraq, such a specific big intervention, maybe the biggest in the last 3 decades?
So it depends on the situation and the country. In a country where American domestic politics are not involved, the embassy and the ambassador make most of the decisions because Washington is paying attention to other things. When the situation in a country becomes so serious that it's on the American television news at night, it becomes so serious that people in Congress are talking about it, when you have on social media important people talking about the situation, then the American domestic politics do become involved, and then the White House, the president, the Oval Office, and the National Security Council become more involved. And then the embassy still has a role, but it is not the kul fakul. It's not the main force. It's one of several voices. During my time in Iraq, quickly the Iraq situation, really from the beginning, American domestic politics were involved. And so everything from the plan for elections came from the White House to the timing to the issues about the surge. The surge was an idea generated by David Petraeus and the American military with ideas from me and others in the State Department, but the president had to approve it. It went to the White House for final decision. So in Syria, when the revolution began in March of 2011, Syria was not in the American news. Syria was not being discussed in Congress. There were not other countries going to Washington to talk about Syria. The attention was focused on Egypt. The attention was focused on Bahrain. The attention was focused on Libya, but not Syria. And so for a time, March, April, even into May, really the White House was just kind of, I would say, we need to do one, we need to do two, we need to do number three. And for the most part, they agreed. But by summer, now Syria, because of the extent of the murder and the killing and the blood, was on television and was being discussed in Congress, and other countries were going to Washington and saying, the Americans need to fix this problem. The Americans need to fix this problem. Now suddenly the White House becomes involved. And just for example, when Barack Obama announced in August of 2003 that Bashar al-Assad should step aside, that wasn't my idea. They asked me what I thought about the idea, and I said, I don't think it's a good idea. I said, first, Bashar al-Assad will ignore it, and so American credibility will diminish. I said, and second, it'll make it even more difficult for us to talk to Assad. So there's no advantage to us in dealing with the Syrians to do this. But they made the decision, Judd, they made the decision because of American domestic politics. There were Republicans and Democrats both in Congress in August demanding that Barack Obama tell Bashar al-Assad to step aside.
We will come back to this period, but I'll just ask some questions before to put it into context. One last question about Iraq, maybe relating to Syria. In your tenure in Iraq, did the name Abu Muhammad al-Jolani ring a bell back then?
Never. Not once.
Even
Never.
Even when he was incarcerated.
Yeah, even though. But we had thousands and thousands of people at Buka camp and in other camps, but thousands of them. No.
So the questions about Syria now as a context, how do you explain the shifts in policy between the Bush era trying to isolate Syria and diminish the relations to a slower extent, and then drastic shift with Obama, which ended by sending you as an ambassador to Syria?
So Obama in the election campaign of 2008 understood that the Iraq war was not popular. And even the Afghanistan war, most Americans supported it, but more and more Americans were questioning the Bush administration ability to find a good end to Afghanistan. But in Iraq, by 2008, most Americans wanted out. Just get the forces out. Obama, as part of his thinking about foreign policy, and Obama is a thinker. He does think. He's a lawyer, right? A very trained lawyer from Harvard University. Part of his thinking was, we need to talk to countries who are our enemies to see if we can find compromises and reach at least short-term deals. So in Iraq, for example, we knew Syria was helping jihadis go from Damascus airport into Iraq. We had very good intelligence. We captured computers from al-Qaeda during some of the American military raids, and on the computers, the al-Qaeda organizers would say, Fulan came from Damascus on this date, assigned to this town. We had very detailed information. And we knew which countries they came from and which days they came into Damascus and how they got. So we understood that. So Syria was a problem for us in Iraq, and frankly, a bigger problem for the Iraqis. Syrians were involved, for example, in the bombing of the foreign ministry in August of 2009. So the Bush administration wanted to isolate Syria, but it was not having a good effect. It wasn't changing what Assad was doing. So Obama thought, okay, let's have a conversation with the Syrians. Will not be an easy conversation, will be a difficult conversation, but let's see if we can have a conversation and see what exactly does Assad want and how can we make him stop sending these jihadis in. Same with Hezbollah. There was a lot of concern in Washington in 2010 that there would be a new war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So how many times did the Americans say to Syria, you need to stop helping Hezbollah? But it was, the conversation was very short and very unproductive, very sterile. So Obama's thinking was, have an ambassador in a place like Syria or Cuba, because of all the problems with Cuba in Central America, have conversations with the Iranians, not that we like Iranians, but we don't want to fight a war with Iran, so let's have a conversation with them to see if we can't find arrangements that could be made.
So what has been said about the mission in Syria is to change the behavior of al-Assad rather than change the regime. Was
Absolutely.
Accurate?
Correct. Absolutely correct.
What was
not regime change? No one in Washington. The Obama administration, after George Bush, the Obama administration did not want regime change. Not anywhere. They were against regime change. That regime change is George W. Bush.
Yeah. So when you were going to Syria with that mission, what were the main lines of trying to change the behavior? What was the carrot? What was the stick in this negotiation?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So the Americans sent me to Syria. We didn't have particular carrots identified, and we didn't have particular sticks, in part because we didn't know exactly what was Assad's thinking. Why was he sending jihadis to Iraq? Like, was that to pressure the Americans? Or was that because he wanted to change the government in Baghdad? He wanted to get rid of Nouri al-Maliki? Why was he doing it? Like, we didn't understand. So the point was to have conversations like that. Same, I think with Hezbollah, we had a somewhat better understanding, but I think there was a different question of, could you convince Assad to abandon Hezbollah? And that's where the negotiations you and I were talking about a little while ago between Ambassador Fred Hoff and Assad about Hezbollah and Iran on one side and the Golan and Netanyahu on the other side. So the Obama administration was pursuing several different tracks with the goal of changing behavior.
So I'll ask you about these details that maybe we spoke about before we started shooting. The first question is, what was the conclusion that you had after the meetings in Syria with Assad? Why did he send some fighters to Iraq? What was his rationale?
So in my first meeting with Bashar al-Assad in January, he denied that the Syrian mukhabarat, the Syrian intelligence, was helping jihadis go to Iraq. And we had a kind of ridiculous conversation where I said, Mr. President, we know you're doing it. There's no reason to deny it. It would be a much more productive conversation to talk about why you're doing it and what do you want to make it stop. And he said, I don't want to discuss this. And I said, but Mr. President, we have very good intelligence on this. I said, we have captured what I said before. Yeah. We have the computers, we know when they came, etc. So instead of arguing about whether or not it's happening, let's talk about why it's happening and how to fix the problem. And he refused to discuss it in my first meeting in January.
Well, that was an uncomfortable meeting.
Well, it was it was not and it's the first time, and that's okay, I understand. As-sabr muftah al-faraj, be patient. So that meeting was in late January. By February, I was starting to meet some of the other people in the Syrian government that were high enough up that we could begin to have these conversations. And we were starting to talk a little bit about why they were doing it, why, not what did they want in exchange, but just why, so we could understand. But then the revolution started, and it quickly became impossible to have a conversation about anything except the murder and the bloodshed on the street every day.
And the why was what?
The why was they felt the Americans were encircling them.
Okay, so that was a defense mechanism to keep them.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were worried that the American military would come to Damascus. And so better for the Syrian government to fight the Americans in Iraq than to fight them in Syria.
Right. The other point that you mentioned was that to try to talk to Bashar al-Assad to know how far might he, how willing is he to maybe take a distance from Iran and Hezbollah in return for a peace agreement with Israel and the return of the Golan to Syria. What happened in these talks that, if I remember correctly, started with the mediation of Turkey, Bashar al-Assad, Turkey, and Israel, and then now a new...
Right. So then the Obama administration came. So two things. Number one, I was not the person doing this negotiation. I had a colleague, Fred Hoff, from the Department of State, who was leading this track under George Mitchell and the peace office in the State Department. So Fred was essentially negotiating between Netanyahu and Bashar al-Assad some kind of an agreement that would involve the Israelis returning at least part of, if not all, they were still negotiating that, the exact line, the Golan, and in return, Bashar al-Assad would stop supporting Hezbollah and reduce his relationship with Iran. Those were the parameters that they were discussing. Did they agree on details? No. And the negotiations were making a little progress. Fred told me he thought he was making some progress. He stayed at my residence when he visited when he visited Damascus in April of 2010 for another round of talks. I did not attend the talks, only Fred did with Bashar al-Assad. But Fred and I, over dinner at the ambassador's house that night, discussed it. Fred was optimistic, but he understood there was no deal yet. But quickly what happened was Washington, the Obama administration, decided they could not discuss peace between Israel and Syria at a time when the Assad government was committing enormous violations of human rights in Syria because of the revolution. And the peace talks simply stopped because of the domestic situation inside Syria.
How did you see Bashar al-Assad dealing with you? Because one would think that since your goal in this mission was to try to have an approachment and maybe engage Bashar al-Assad for change in behavior, was he maybe willing to go to a certain extent in a diplomatic matter and change his behavior, or was he stalling because he had specific goals and you saw your mission just going in circles?
So I arrived at the end of January, and the president's protocol had me meet Bashar al-Assad very quickly, which was, I thought, a positive sign. Sometimes you have to wait weeks and weeks before you can present your papers from your president, Obama in my case, to the host country president so that you can begin your work. The Syrian presidency did that very fast, so they were welcoming in that sense, and I thought we all thought that was a positive sign. The meeting itself that I had with Bashar al-Assad, and there are pictures of the meeting, you can find them. Yeah. The meeting itself was pretty difficult. because we talked about fighters going into Iraq from Syria. We talked about human rights in Syria. We talked about Hezbollah. We talked about weapons of mass destruction, so which were Washington's priorities. And I would say the meeting was difficult. But so what? I mean, I've had difficult meetings in all of the countries I work in, and it's normal. The point is to have a frank conversation, not a happy conversation, a frank one.
Yeah.
So in the weeks that followed that meeting, I was able to meet other Syrian
But
cabinet
in that
ministers.
meeting, you felt that he was evasive.
Oh, absolutely. But what I would say, Judd,
What is his agenda? So you told me about the priorities of Washington. What were the
I would
Syrian
say
priorities?
Bashar al-Assad was not in a hurry to negotiate any agreement with the Americans. I think he was suspicious of Washington, probably suspicious of me because I had been in Iraq. And so, you know, the Syrians are good negotiators. They don't hurry. They take their time. They're not like Americans who like to get a deal, get her done, and finish and then go to the next thing. Syrians, and they're not the only ones in the Middle East this way. They negotiate carefully, step by step, khutwa khutwa, not like the Americans with this big tadafuk forward. So it's normal. But what was not normal was what was happening in Syria very quickly. The first demonstration against the government in Syria with the Arab Spring was just 2 weeks after that meeting, when there was a sudden demonstration in Suq al-Hari'a in downtown Damascus. So events quickly made it impossible to have a discussion in detail about Iraq or about WMD or about human rights. Well, human rights we did discuss, but WMD, it was impossible. The situation in Syria, it collapsed very quickly, 6 months.
How did you receive the news of the beginning of the revolution? Did you anticipate that
No.
America would be believed to have a role in all of the demonstrations and all of the Arab
Well, America
in
didn't.
Syria?
I mean, America didn't really want a role in the revolution, and I certainly didn't want the Americans to have a role, except with the exception, Judd, of defending the human rights of all Syrian citizens. And those human rights are in the United Nations Charter of Universal Human Rights. And Syria signed it. So did the Americans. So the international community can speak about agreements between governments about the respect for human rights on the basis of the United Nations Universal Charter. That we can do. So that's the only American role that I saw. And I did raise cases of Syrian troops shooting at peaceful protesters. I went to Hama specifically because we thought the Syrian government might attack the demonstrations that weekend that we went. We had some signs that the Syrian army was mobilizing around Hama, and the history of Hama is known. So that was the point of that trip, was to say we're watching. But the Americans didn't have a role beyond that. And I'll be very frank, after Obama said that Assad should step aside, my view was, still is, that Syrians have to negotiate between Syrians about whatever government they want. Later, after Hillary Clinton left the Department of State and John Kerry arrived, several times, 2 different times, John Kerry said to me, we need a list of Syrians who could be in a new government, a transition government. And I'll give it to the Russians. And 2 times I said, Mr. Secretary, we did exactly that in Iraq. And every time we did it in Iraq, we chose the wrong people. We are not able to identify who are the good people. The Americans cannot do it. We just do not have the knowledge. We have to let Syrians, who do have the knowledge, they know each other, they know each other's families, they know each other's histories, we have to let the Syrians negotiate that. All we want to do is create a space where Syrians can come together and negotiate between Syrians.
You said before that you were not in the opinion that what Obama proclaimed that Assad should go.
Yeah.
That was not your opinion. What was your opinion on the best recourse?
The whole time I was in Damascus in the summer and autumn of 2011, we were trying to get the government to sit with opposition figures and chart a way forward. It was something I talked to Buthaina Shaban about. It was something I talked to Walid Muallim about. At one point, there was a meeting between me and the French and British ambassadors, Eric Chevalier and Simon Collis, and me, in the office of Walid Muallim at the Foreign Ministry. And Muallim asked us, can you help arrange for us to talk to the Syrian opposition? Now, Judd, can you imagine that? I was so surprised, I was shocked that a Syrian foreign minister would ask 3 Western governments to get so involved. And I made Muallim say it again, and we're writing notes. And I said, we cannot negotiate for you. All we can do is urge opposition people to take your offer seriously and try it. That's as far as we can go.
How did you read this demand from Muallim?
I read it as 2 things. Number one, that part of the government did want to have a dialogue with the opposition. Part of the government.
Might he make this demand without the approval of Bashar al-Assad?
I think that's a great question. I can't answer it except to say I would think Assad has to approve it, but I have no intelligence. Remember, it's not the Hollywood movies. I have no intelligence that said Bashar approved it. So, and of course, our response in the office of the foreign minister was very careful, because was Muallim speaking for himself? Was Muallim speaking on behalf of the government? I mean, I can't answer that. But there was a Syrian note taker too.
Wow.
And we know Mukhabarat are everywhere in Syria. So I think Muallim understood that even if he made this request, that the presidency was not going to be angry. They might just say, well, let's see what happens. Because at the same time, they're pursuing a heavy-duty security repress policy. So the second thing when he said this is I thought, it's going to be hard to convince the opposition, because who do you even talk to? There was no unified opposition leadership. You had some political figures in the Syrian opposition, but did they control the demonstrations? No. You had the Tansiqiyat, but did they control the demonstrations? Well, maybe they would control it in one city, but not the other cities. It was very
Might that be
fractured.
the reason why Al-Muallim demanded this demand?
In order to accentuate the divisions? Yeah, possibly.
Or to,
Possibly.
to push the American to be frustrated from the opposition?
Yeah, it's possible. And certainly we were frustrated later. But in any case, had there been a sincere dialogue, maybe the worst of the Civil War could have been avoided. Maybe. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine ever that the Assad government would share power with people outside the government. I mean, that's just, but you know what? In the end, that's not an American decision. That's a Syrian decision.
You mentioned that maybe a faction from the Syrian government might be willing to. what is your determination about these factions in the government? What wings did they have?
Well, I cannot, again, this is real life, not Hollywood. I can't give you these 10 people are in the peace faction and these 10 people are in the security faction. So what I conclude, though, is there were obviously differences. And we heard hints of it from some of the meetings I was at with different Syrians who sometimes worked or consulted at the presidency. So we heard about that. We knew there were some people who were very hardline. So Abu Wail, Khairbek, for example, when I met him, now he's dead, but at the time he was, I think he had the title of Vice President for Security, some fancy title. But in any case, he was on the inside, maybe not in the family, but the next circle up. He was very hardline. And other people like Walid Mualim seemed maybe not to be quite so hardline. So in the end, it didn't really matter about the divisions inside the government because the government was doing things on the ground. And even if there's this peace group over here, the reality is yesterday they arrested and killed 25 people. And the day before, they shot 10 people. And at last Friday's protest, they killed 30 people. And that's the reality. And so this peace group over here, what do they represent? It doesn't matter. Which is why it was so important to speak publicly about the human rights violations, because you don't want these people to be undermined, but you want the side that's repressing to understand we're watching and there will be consequences eventually.
So before I interrupted you answering my question about why did you oppose or was not in the opinion of Obama that Assad should go, you were saying that you preferred dialogue between the two parts because it was your belief that Assad wouldn't go. So this was an inflammatory remark without any real results.
Yeah, it wasn't going to change anything Assad was going to do. I don't think it
So
did.
it made your mission impossible.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I told them that, if we say this, it's the end of having a discussion with the Syrian government. I mean, that will close the doors. Washington's concern was that there would be another attack on the American embassy. We already had one very serious attack on the American embassy after my visit to Hama, where the government organized a group of Shabiha, and very, very capable Shabiha, who attacked the American embassy the week after my visit to Hama. And Washington's concern was there would be another attack like that, and maybe even hostages taken, kind of an Iran 1979 scenario. So that was their number one concern. I don't think they were concerned as much about whether or not it was going to help Syrian turmoil come to a close. I think the president had a domestic political reason for doing it.
How were your later meetings with Bashar al-Assad after the revolution?
I never met Bashar al-Assad. I only met him 2 times. I met him in January and I met him in March.
In March, it wasn't yet began?
Well, it had just started, and we had a delegation from the American Senate. They were Republican Party senators, actually. And they came right after the problems in Daraa were becoming serious. And I talked to the senators, and I said, this is happening, and it's a problem, and it could get much worse, and it would be good to raise it. And none of the Republican senators did. They were so nice to Bashar al-Assad. They made me look like a screaming hawk.
Why? They didn't want to...
Because they didn't press him on anything. They were very polite and didn't argue with him. And really, it would be better for me if they hadn't come. But anyway, that's a different
later on, you bemoaned the fact that the U.S. didn't aid the moderate factions of the opposition. Why is that? Or the U.S. didn't aid anyone?
Well, the Americans had a program with the CIA to send arms to some elements of the Syrian armed opposition. But the program was very slow to start, The program was very slow to be implemented, and it wasn't coordinated really at all with other countries. And other countries were also providing weapons to the opposition. And often what we were seeing was that a group the Americans were supporting would then be attacked by a group that Turkey or Qatar was supporting. And so the opposition factions were fighting each other instead of working together to fight the Assad government. It really was crazy. And
why
and
an effort to coordinate the efforts didn't take place or was not successful?
well, there were discussions, and certainly the CIA, I'm not a CIA spokesperson. I mean, I worked at the State Department, but we knew that the CIA was talking to some of these other countries to try to get coordination. But in reality, the other countries had their own interests and their own agendas. And again, it's a situation where the Americans didn't fully understand what they were dealing with and were unable to spend enough energy and time to address the problem. So just to speak frankly about Turkey, for example, the Turks were enabling jihadis to go over the border. I raised it several times with the Turkish authorities. And the Turkish authorities' response was, if you give us the names of people before they arrive in Istanbul airport, we will arrest them. But of course, this isn't Hollywood.
Yeah.
We don't have the names of all of these people. We don't know the names of every person joining ISIS or joining Al-Qaeda. And we said to the Turks, you need to have enough security people at the border to screen, to check everybody that crosses that border. And if Fulan is coming out of Tunisia or Algeria to join an extremist group, block them, send them back to Algeria or to Tunisia or to Jordan or to Caucasus Mountains, or send them back. But you need more people at the border. You don't have enough, and the people you have are looking this way when they go in. It was a conversation which, frankly, we weren't making a lot of progress on. And it was raised eventually at a very high level in Washington. I sat in meetings where top people at the Department of State were raising this with the Turkish authorities. But the Turks had their own agenda, which was bring down Assad no matter the cost. The American position was put enough pressure on Assad so that Syrians negotiate with Syrians. They're different agendas.
Yeah.
And you can't, the only way to fix that problem is for one president to talk to another president and have a very frank discussion, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 frank discussions to work out an arrangement. But those conversations never took place. Frankly, I don't think Barack Obama wanted to spend the time. He had a busy agenda. He's working on healthcare in the United States and education in the United States.
Syria wasn't a priority.
Oh.
But there was a point that it seemed like a priority when the whole region was waiting for the American strike on Syria.
After the Ghouta?
The chemical weapons. And then it didn't happen.
No.
And a sort of a deal was worked out through the Russians. How did this whole episode come about? Because why was the tension so elevated that the strike would come in a matter of hours, then it didn't happen, then the deal, then the Russians come in?
Yeah. So it started because Barack Obama, in August of 2012, said if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons, that would be a red line. That statement did not come from the Department of State. We would never have said red line because I knew, especially from Iraq, that Barack Obama did not want to use American military force in Syria.
He would be trapped.
I mean, his political campaign was to get America out of Middle East wars, not to get America in new Middle East wars. So I knew he did not want to use American military power. So we would never say red line in the State Department when we had our daily press briefing at the Department of State. We'd never say red line, never. When Obama said that, I was so surprised. One of my staff came to my office and said, Obama just said red line in Syria, and I didn't believe him. I said, no, he wouldn't say that. And they brought me the transcript, and by God, he did say it. I was shocked. So then we had these absurd situations, Judd, in October, November, January, February, March, where the Syrian government was testing us. And they would use a small chemical weapon, maybe mustard or chlorine up in Khan Yunis or Khan al-Assal, up where there was fighting up in the north in Idlib and Aleppo province. But maybe only 3 people die, 5 people die, 7 people die. And we had these ridiculous meetings in the National Security Council, which I attended, where does that count for the red line? 5 people died? Oh, no, it's not so big? Okay. How many? Like, what's the number? And these ridiculous discussions continued as Assad continued here and there, not every day, not every week, but once every couple of weeks, there'd be a chemical weapons use here or there. And some people would die, and we would discuss, does that trigger the red line? And we never had an answer. The White House could not answer this question. Then when I woke up on, what was the date, August 20th, 2013, and I turned on the news and they said 1,000 people died, I thought, that triggers the red line. So I go into work, and of course they're all aflutter. John Kerry and others, and there was a National Security Council meeting attended by the president, and the president was, I mean, he said, this is too much. What should we do? And people like the State Department, John Kerry and I, said, we need to do a strike just to deter him from doing this again. I mean, we don't want to get in the war, but do one sharp, hard strike and then go. And Obama was not enthusiastic. And by the way, most of the other people at the table, the other parts of the U.S. government, intelligence community, Pentagon, others, most of them agreed a strike was the right thing to do. I don't remember I think Biden was against it, as I remember. So we were then asked to prepare papers, each of us, the different departments, about why to do a strike. This is after Obama's already said the red line. Yeah. So I remember writing the paper that afternoon, and I had 3 reasons. So my memo to Kerry, which he then took to the president, 3 reasons. Number 1, if the Americans didn't react, if we just watched this chemical weapons attack and there's no deterrence, Assad would do it again and again. He would continue to do it, and maybe even bigger scale. Second, if Assad did that, the response from the Syrian opposition would be that they would conclude the West, the United States, Europe, and moderate Arab countries had abandoned them, and it would increase the recruiting power of extremist groups like the Nusra Front and, ISIS was just beginning to form at that time. But it would help them. And it would hurt the people that we were trying to help in terms of getting to a negotiation between Syrians. And the last point was, if Assad uses chemical weapons more regularly, it would encourage other states to reconsider whether they too could use chemical weapons without international reactions. So, but I lost that argument. So in the end, Obama did not want to use military force. The American Congress did not want to use military force. No matter what the Republican Party said, they were not willing to vote for it. and the same with the Democrats.
Because it was an electoral suicide
Well,
for
because
internal reasons.
this was Obama's thinking, and I think many people in Congress also agreed. And Obama explained this to us. Said, suppose we do the strike and we blow some things up. And 1 month later, Assad uses chemical weapons again. Then everyone would look at Washington again and say, you need to do another strike, but this time harder. And so imagine the Americans do it. They do another strike and it's harder. And Assad waits a couple of months, and then his situation is very bad, and he uses chemical weapons a third time. And everyone would look at Washington and say, you must do something. Do more strikes, harder. And he said, this continues to escalate, and the Americans aren't in charge of the escalation. Assad is in charge. He's the one that's deciding if there's an escalation, not the Americans. He said, you're making it so that the American credibility is dependent on Bashar al-Assad. And he did not want that. He did not want to give Bashar al-Assad that kind of power.
How come then?
Which leads to as I said then, we had these arguments. And I said, look, I said, you're worried about the Americans falling into a war because we did a strike and then maybe it doesn't end and we lose credibility. And that they said, that's right. That's exactly what we're nervous about. I said, well, you can always decide to stop escalating. You could always do that. I said, we could have done that in Vietnam too. We could have stopped. So they said, yes, but if we do that, we lose credibility. And I said, but if you don't strike now, you also lose credibility. And they didn't like that. They had no answer to that. I said, you risk credibility either way you choose.
So the problem began when Obama put that red line.
Initially, he should never have done that.
And then there was no way out.
Yeah. So I had lunch with Obama, a private lunch with Obama, 1.5 years after I resigned. I was very surprised, but he invited me to lunch at the White House with another American ambassador named Ryan Crocker. We both went. And I mentioned this to Obama. And I mentioned also that he said Assad should step aside. And I said, these were mistakes. Now, this is 2015. The Syrian civil war is still raging. There's no answer. It's still fighting, still people dying. I said, these were mistakes. They didn't help. And Obama got very angry at me at the lunch, yeah. And
what was his response?
I mean, he's polite, but he was angry. He was annoyed. And he said, look, I think the American government and the president should be able to speak about human rights or to speak about the use of chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction without it automatically meaning that we are going to go to war. And I said, absolutely. I said, but then you don't use the word red line ever. And I said, and frankly, you don't tell another head of state to step aside. You say he needs to work harder to find a solution or something like that. But once you say step aside, you're the American president. You've just thrown down an ultimatum. And he said, I reject that was an ultimatum. He said, I told people the same statement, Syrians have to decide their government, not the United States. And it's true. He did say that, same statement. But everybody focused on the first sentence, not the second sentence. I said that to him. I said, you're trying to slice this issue very thinly. I said, it doesn't work. People pay attention to the first sentence and not to the second sentence. He didn't like that. He was very unhappy with that.
Definitely.
He said, I reject that we have to use the military every time we have a problem with another country. And I said, just don't speak provocatively.
At the same time?
Speak provocatively behind closed doors, not in open public.
Not in media. But how did then the U.S. so easily accepted the Russian role in Syria?
They were, at least in with respect to the Ghouta and the chemical attack, they were so happy to have a possible escape from the red line situation with a diplomatic solution. And I went to Geneva with John Kerry when they negotiated that with Foreign Minister Lavrov. And I said to Kerry, behind closed doors, I said, you know, Assad's not going to respect this. And then what are we going to do? I said, we're still going to have a problem. And Kerry said, the Russians have said, if the Syrians do this, if they don't respect it, if they violate the agreement, then we can go to the United Nations and have a Chapter 7 discussion. Chapter 7 is sanctions or military force. And I said, and you believe the Russians? So I said, you believe the Russians? And he said, yes.
He doesn't have any other option.
Yeah. I said, why do you think the Russians came here to Geneva? Why do you think they're even doing this? And he said, because they're scared the Americans are going to do a military attack. And I said, but the Russians must read the New York Times. The Russians must know that we don't have support in Congress and the president doesn't want to do it. That's in the New York Times. Don't the Russians, I'm sure that the Russian intelligence reads the New York Times. And he didn't have an answer. This is why I often say hope is not the same thing as analysis. The Americans hoped that the agreement would
But
work.
until this point, you mentioned through your tenure in Iraq and now in Syria that most of your efforts were brought down by the administration on basic issues. There are many other issues that maybe from a day-to-day work standpoint did work well. Why do you think that those people who are in positions of power in State Department or in the White House or as secretaries make the wrong decision most of the time? Is it
I don't know if
because
they make it
don't
most of
know?
the time, but they make the wrong decision often.
Yeah, is it because they don't know the region, or because they have internal political considerations that even if they know, they wouldn't care?
So it's both. Sometimes they don't have intelligence to understand what's happening. That's frequent. Iraq 2003, I think, is a good example. But sometimes it's domestic politics, and I think Obama in Syria was very much that. He needed politically in Washington, domestic politics in 2003, August 2003. He needed to look strong. The Republicans and even some Democrats and some foreign countries were saying Obama is weak on Syria.
So why didn't he go for regime change then?
Because he didn't want to start a new war, and he understood he had learned a lesson from Iraq.
He needs to look strong but not go so far.
And my point would have been to say Syria's not really the biggest American problem. I mean, we regret the killing, we support a negotiation, but we're not going to use military force. And it's up to Syrians to decide who their government should be, not us. That's a much more neutral position than saying we have to have a new president. I mean, first of all, who would the new president even be? We don't know.
Yeah.
So he then he took my advice. Syrians have to decide this, not the Americans. And then he says, so Syrians have to decide. But the Americans have already said, but it can't be Bashar al-Assad. We had these ridiculous conversations, Judd, sometimes in the American administration. Kerry or Hillary Clinton would come out and say, it cannot be Bashar al-Assad. He has to go. The Russians would say, there's nothing in the Geneva Agreement of June 2011 that we negotiated with the Americans and with the UN Secretary General that says Assad has to go. It just says there has to be a negotiated transition government. When the Syrian opposition finally when we had the Geneva conference in January and February of 2014, finally, took a year to finally get there, year and a half, the Syrian opposition, with the backing of the Free Syrian Army, parts of it at least, gave Lakhdar Brahimi at the conference in Geneva a proposal in writing. I didn't write it, and I never saw it, but Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN mediator, told me about it, and the opposition told me. The proposal said, we will negotiate a new transition government in Syria, every position to be negotiated, including President of the Republic. And when Lakhdar Brahimi got this paper, he thought, a breakthrough. Now we can maybe make some progress, because the implication was, under the right circumstances, the opposition at that time, the Etilaf, would accept that Bashar al-Assad stays. There would obviously be conditions and other things, but the principle was that perhaps Bashar al-Assad could stay. So I briefed John Kerry, and he said, we can't accept that. And I said, well, wait, Mr. Secretary, this is not our negotiation. The Syrians have to negotiate this. We cannot insist that Bashar al-Assad go when the Syrian opposition itself is willing, under the right circumstances, to accept him. I said, we can't be plus royal que le roi. And he just was silent. He just didn't say anything. Now, as it turned out,
Why?
The Syrian government negotiator, Ambassador Jafri, refused to discuss it at all. He just said, we're not going to discuss this. And that was actually when the conference broke down. The Jafri said, we are here only to talk about security and opposition cooperation with the Syrian Arab Army and the intelligence services against the opposition armed forces. That was his condition. The invitation from the UN Secretary General had been to discuss creating a transition government, but the Syrian government ignored that and said, we're here only to talk about security. We convinced, this was our last night in Geneva, we convinced the opposition coalition to accept two tracks. One track to talk about security and one track to talk about forming the transition government. So there'd be two parallel tracks. To be honest, the Etilaf was not enthusiastic, but they said, we'll try it. We took that to the Russians. This was our last day. Wendy Sherman, who was then the political undersecretary at the State Department, she led our group in the meeting with the Russians. And Wendy was great. She was very tough. And I like Wendy. And we said to the Russians, two tracks. You need to get the Ambassador Jafari and his people to accept that there's going to be a political transition government track in line with the Secretary General's invitation. And the opposition will also discuss security on a parallel track. And the Russians said, no, we won't do that. And we were shocked because the invitation had said transition government, political track.
Yeah.
And the Russians said no. And Wendy said, you are backing away from everything that John Kerry and Lavrov agreed on in Moscow the previous April. And so that's when I decided I had to resign.
That was the final straw?
I had already decided to leave after the chemical weapons. And I had another job lined up in the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of State. The paperwork was signed. And John Kerry actually intervened with the Human Resources Personnel Department of the State Department to have the assignment canceled, ripped up. And he said to me, Robert, we need you for the Geneva talks. They're coming. And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, the Geneva talks will fail. And I said, and then we're all going to look bad. I said, I just don't want to support this policy anymore. It's not serious. And we either like say we don't care and we leave, or we do enough pressure that we get a negotiation. So he convinced me to stay. He asked me to stay through the Geneva talks. When they failed, 2 weeks later, I left.
I was going to ask if you said that these negotiations in Geneva took a year to prepare to reach
a year and a
point.
half.
Yeah. Why did the Russians suddenly back down? Because they are on the other side of this preparation.
Yeah.
Was it the situation on the ground was moving towards their favor, so they don't?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I can't answer it. Hollywood, I don't have the perfect information. I think two things. Number one, Bashar's situation in early 2014 was not desperate. It was desperate a year and a half later, in summer of 2015, which is when the Russians had to send their air force. But in early 2014, it wasn't desperate. And I think also maybe the Russians understood the limits of their influence, that maybe they would not be able to convince Bashar al-Assad to negotiate a transition government, that they did not have so much influence. You know, the Americans are usually kind of stupid this way and will often say, well, we'll try. And maybe it's, I mean, we tried. How many times do we try with Nouri al-Maliki and we didn't succeed? Or with Ibrahim Jafari and we didn't succeed, Jafari president or whatever. So the Americans sometimes will, like Mana La Mancha, Don Quixote, they will charge at a windmill, even if the chances of success are not very good. And it just diminishes their credibility. But there's kind of an American optimism, which is hard to overcome.
We'll move a little bit forward now to see, now you're resigned, but you're still following and I'm sure you'll be having some calls from the Secretary of State to ask you questions about Syria because of your experience there. Through your following, when you were in Syria and then you left, when did you first hear of the name Muhammad al-Jolani?
Oh, well, I heard the name when I was working on Syria in
But nothing
2013.
serious as a big role in Syria?
Well, the Jabhat al-Nusra was a problem for the Americans. It was a problem in two ways. Number one, it represented a direct threat to the American embassy in Damascus. The reason we had to close the American embassy in Damascus when I was there in February 2012 was not because of what the Syrian government was doing. I mean, we didn't like it, but it was because the Jabhat al-Nusra was looking at a possible attack against the American embassy, which we had good intelligence about. This time we had good intelligence. So the intelligence didn't come from Syria, I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. But there's a bigger problem, even beyond the American embassy, which is that if the Syrian armed opposition radicalized and became dominated by extremists, then the American policy goal in the Obama administration of having a Syrian-to-Syrian negotiation to create a transition government along the lines of the United Nations agreement from June 30, 2012, it would be impossible to have that negotiation between Syrians if one side was totally radicalized, if the opposition was totally radicalized. So it was a problem for American policy. So in that context, I led the effort to get the Nusra Front put on the American terrorism list, and we finished that in December 2012.
And how did you read the permanent shifts that he made? So he left al-Nusra, he went to different titled groups, and which led finally to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in order to escape the branding of a specific group. Was this on the map, on the radar, understood or not?
I have to say, I mean, I left Washington in 2015 and moved very far away. So I was not talking day to day with people still in the U.S. government. It's not my job. I'm retired. What I would say is there were some analysts, Charles Lister, Darian Khalifa and others, who said he is making changes. It's interesting. I cannot say that I was following Ahmed Sharab, Mohammed Jolani day to day. I was not. I knew that they were up in the Northeast. I saw that they destroyed the Free Syrian Army, which we had backed. During 2015 and 2016, they took out the last of the groups. CIA stopped its program in 2017 under orders from Donald Trump, but the program was already moribund. It was already dead, practically. So I looked at Jolani as he's a smart guy. He's tied to al-Qaeda. But I didn't think too much more about it. To me, the Civil War had become a terrible tragedy. And after the fall of Aleppo, I was profoundly depressed, profoundly depressed. I didn't see a solution for Syria, frankly. It just seemed like the war would go on forever. And in the meantime, the American sanctions were doing to Syria what the American sanctions had done in Iraq. They were just destroying the Syrian middle class.
Wow.
I mean, the war was bad, but the sanctions were only impoverishing Syrians. So I was already not in favor of the sanctions. When I was offered an invitation to go to Syria,
That was my next question.
yeah.
Of
No,
this
when I
little
was
firestorm.
yeah, when I was invited to go there, I was at first very reluctant. I didn't want to be in an orange suit with some guy holding a knife to my throat. That was not really how I wanted to finish.
What was the purpose of this invitation? Because it made a little bit of a firestorm with the reply.
Yeah, so what I would say is in the first visit I made, which was in March 2023, my personal agenda was to facilitate contacts between the United Nations aid offices and the Salvation Government in Idlib. We'd had the earthquake, and there was, and of course these cross-border aid flows every 6 months came to the Security Council for a renewed mandate, etc. And the Russians were always putting pressure on this. So it seemed to me that it was more important than ever that those aid flows continue, especially after the earthquake, and that the Salvation Government figure out a way, with Turkish help, to get some kind of a regular liaison. And that's what I raised. So my personal agenda was to help regularize liaison between the United Nations Aid Office and the Salvation Government. And the first people we met were not Ahmed Shara or Mohammed Jalani. We met his ministers who worked on aid issues. And we toured around the province and we went to different places. Second agenda was to understand what was happening to the Christian community in Idlib, which was very small. But there are lobby elements in Washington who pay attention to that. Conservative Christian elements who believe in religious freedom and write about these things. But no American had been in Idlib to look at it. So the Salvation Government arranged that we go and talk to them. And we learned, it was interesting, I had no idea, that the Salvation Government was actually returning houses and returning agriculture lands that had been seized from Christians in Idlib, in some of these little towns. I think one of them was called Yusufia. So, and Aknia. So all of that was interesting. And at the very end of that trip, we had, trying to remember if it was lunch, we had a lunch with Ahmed Shara, with Mohammed Jalani. So we talked in general about the general political situation in Syria. He made clear that his objective was the overthrow of the Assad government. He didn't change. I expressed my doubts that that would happen and said, you know, there eventually needs to be peace talks. And if you want to be in those peace talks, you have to get away from terrorism. I mean, nobody's going to treat with you if you're a terrorist. Nobody will. Nobody in the West is going to support you if you're a terrorist. Support your presence in the peace talks. So we returned to Idlib in September 2023.
With the same NGO?
Yes. And we met the Christians again. And by then, we learned that all of the homes and all of the agricultural lands, except one piece of agricultural land, had been returned. Which is pretty interesting. If you think that the Salvation Government was a hardline Taliban-type government, why would they be helping Christians that way? It's an interesting
Maybe
question.
to send you a message.
I don't think they were interested in sending me a message. I think they were more interested in sending Washington a message.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. So we also asked to see the Druze. There were some little Druze villages in western Idlib, and the Salvation government agreed we could go over there. So we depended on them for transport. We didn't bring our own cars in. So they drove us over. I have to say the Druze community lived in terrible poverty. But there too, the government had said they were going to restore homes and agricultural lands that had been taken. And everyone was sort of curious, would this happen, would this not? So at the end of that visit, after we talked to the Jews, we also had a round table with a group of business people and professors and journalists in downtown Idlib, where I wanted to hear what they thought about the future of Syria. How could Syrians come together? I mean, I don't think anyone imagined that Idlib was going to become an independent state. So the question is, how do you bring back the different parts of Syria into one country again? So we had a long discussion about that. And then we had dinner that night before we left with Mohammed Shah. And we talked about everything from the Islamic rules of war, as he interpreted them, to politics in the United States and foreign policy in the Biden administration, the way it looked at Syria, etc. So it was a very broad conversation. In that conversation, I said, "Have you still think you're going to take Damascus?" And he said, "Someday, Yomen Ma." And I said, "Well, imagine you do get to Damascus. Are you going to govern it the same way you govern Idlib?" And he said, "No." He said, "We can't." He said, "This is a very conservative society here in Idlib, and so you govern it in a particular way." But he said, "When we get to Damascus, Damascus is a very different society." And he said it has many more groups and many more elements, and it's more cosmopolitan, and you have to govern it in a different way, which I thought was pretty interesting. So after each of these visits, I did send a letter to the Department of State, to people who work there. It's very interesting to me that they never answered. And what I heard later is people in Washington thought I was a little crazy to go into Idlib. So
you didn't get an approval before you go?
Oh, heavens no. If I asked for approval, they would say no. So no, you don't ask for, and I'm not in the government. I don't take orders from the Department of State. So I have a passport. I have a regular tourist passport, and I can go.
But in that conference that you had maybe 6 months ago now, there was a phrasing that you went with the NGO, the British NGO for conflict resolution, working on turning Ahmad al-Shara from jihadism to politics.
Well, I don't think I said turning.
Yeah.
I think I said taking.
Yeah.
The implication there is that he has to think about how to deal with other Syrians. And it's not my job to tell him how to act with other Syrians. My job is to just encourage him to talk to other Syrians. And that's all. And that's what I did.
So when you heard about the fuss that your words made, that you were training him to...
I mean, first of all, he doesn't need to be trained, and he didn't ask to be trained. I think he's very smart without any American coming at all. Second, we had no mandate to insert the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in a negotiation. The United Nations wasn't asking us to do that. That's Geir Pedersen was running those negotiations, not the British, not the Americans, nothing. So the conversation is rather, how do you see it? What do you think will be effective? Why? Why? Are you looking at these other factors? That's the conversation. Very broad. I don't want Judd, frankly, to get in an argument with the Syrian presidency about what we discussed. They know what we discussed, and I know. So, but we weren't training or trying to change Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because we knew they weren't going to. Just to give you an example, I did ask him, can you imagine having an office of the I'tilaf in Idlib? And he said, not now. And I said, can you describe the conditions? So that's the kind of conversation we had. Can you describe it? I didn't ask him to. I said, can you imagine? So it's not my job to convince him to do anything.
What were his conditions?
I would prefer to leave that to him to answer. I don't want to speak for him.
Good. So what was then your general impression of Ahmad al-Shara? Because he was, during that period, in the phase of a certain transition in the appearance, in the way he speaks, and in the slogans that he might invoke. Was that apparent as an effort?
So I will share with you what I said to Tony Blinken
Yep.
when he called me after the fall of Bashar al-Assad and said, Robert, you've met Shara a couple of times. What do you think? So I told him, I said, look, I said, you will remember from the Obama administration, it was me who led the effort to put him on the terrorism list. And Blinken said, yes, I remember that. Blinken worked in the National Security Council at the time under Obama. I said, I have to tell you, he's not what I expected. He's very pragmatic. I don't think he's a Democrat. I think he rules, governs an essentially a military organization, and he's the general, and generals are not Democrats, they're generals. So, but at the same time, he's pragmatic, and I don't even think that he's going to govern or make Syria into a new Taliban-style Afghanistan. And I shared with him what I said about Damascus.
Oh.
And I said, you never know with people until you talk to them, Mr. Secretary. And so my strong advice is you send someone to talk to him and open a dialogue. I said, can we trust him? I said, who knows? Who can we trust? I mean, that's a different question. I said, but you don't even know that until you have a conversation with him. So send someone and have a conversation.
Right. How did you receive the message, the news of the fall of the regime in such a quick way?
Shocked. I mean, I think almost everybody in the United States was shocked. I had assumed, and I even wrote an article in Majalla saying that probably there would be a discussion between Shara and the Turks and the Russians for some kind of a new ceasefire, maybe before the fall of Homs. I said, I cannot imagine that the Russians are just going to watch. But in fact, my misunderstanding, I think the Russians understood, in a way that I did not, that Assad's government had nothing left, that they were out of resources and they were out of credibility with their own soldiers, and that the regime was going to fall no matter what, and the Russians could not save him. And therefore the Russians were entirely more pragmatic, which I think is something which President Chowda was just talking about in the media a few days ago.
Yeah. You said that you met al-Shara once more. But
In January.
This time he was ruling Syria before getting it. What were the circumstances of that meeting, and if there are any new impressions?
Well, my interest in going to Syria at that point was just to see the country in the wake of the civil war and the end of the Assad government. I felt very lucky that I received this invitation to join the British group. And so we spent about 10 days in Damascus, I got to see some old friends, and I met some new friends, which was fun. And then we also spent time up in Hasaka, where the American soldiers' headquarters is, and talked to the American military and people there. We had dinner with President Chara. It was a very nice dinner. Everything was so new. They were still setting everything up. I recommended that he be serious about the cases of the missing Americans, including Austin Tice. But there are others, including a Syrian-American citizen who was a bishop, who was also kidnapped by armed groups up in the north. And there are other cases of Americans missing. Some died in Syrian government detention. Some we don't know. I said this would be a sensitive issue for the United States government, so please treat it with respect and urgency. Beyond that, we talked about what's going to happen next. We talked about sanctions a little bit. And again, here, I have to admit, I did not expect Donald Trump to cancel all of the sanctions. I know that there were some people in the American administration who were arguing against that, and said that they should use the sanctions as a stick, as leverage.
They went in the middle way, removing them for a year, and then we'll see what happens.
Well, they did, but they've also canceled some essentially permanently by executive order.
Yeah.
The Caesar sanctions are still out there, and those are important. Those are important. They moved a lot faster than the Biden administration would have moved, I think. I think it's good. I'm very happy to see it. I think when I was there, I visited the neighborhood of Yarmouk. And the devastation was just shocking. And we saw from the road, we saw Hasake, we saw Mqadamiyya, and the destruction, Marat no man, we drove past. The destruction was just unbelievable. We drove through parts of Homs, and it's just unbelievable what has been destroyed there. And the country needs peace. It needs time to rebuild. And I think President al-Shara understands that very, very well. So
you seem
I'm
quite
hopeful.
approval of his maybe shift or policy now that he is president.
So I would just share this.
Because
I spent 5 years in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And what I saw there, above everything, was that different communities were afraid of each other. The Kurdish communities in the north were afraid of the Arabs in the south, Sunni and Shia, because, of course, there had been wars, fighting, where the Baghdad government had invaded. The Sunni were very afraid of the Shia. They were afraid of retaliation. They were afraid of exclusion. They were afraid of their future. Would they have jobs in the new Iraq? Would the government retaliate against them? Would there be discrimination in terms of hiring for government jobs, for security jobs? Would there be violations of human rights? People disappeared. They were afraid. The Sunni were terrified. And of course, the Shia were afraid too. They were afraid of the Sunni because of the history of Saddam Hussein and what had happened. I see in Syria now some of this. That when I was in Hasaka, I had a chance to meet with leaders from the autonomous administration, sat with Mazloum Abdi and with others. And what I understood, above all from them, was nervousness about the future and Damascus. Not that Shara had done anything in particular, although there were things they would like changed. But they were more afraid of what he might do in the future, rather than what he had done. Well, for example, there were Turkish drone strikes which killed people up around the Tishreen Dam. And they were Syrians, and they were residents of that part of Syria. And the government in Damascus said nothing, didn't, for example, didn't express sympathy for the loss of Syrian citizens who died, didn't say that the Turks should stop killing Syrian citizens. Just as an example. I understand that, I have to say. It's not an unreasonable point. They are Syrian citizens, and they do deserve protection from their government. So, but the fear of Kurds about what the government in Damascus, what the Ahmad Shara government might do, invade, attack, whatever. And I think we see that with the Alawi community on the coast, and we see that with the large segments of the Druzi community in Soweto. Everyone is afraid of everyone. Of course, the Sunnah in Syria lost so many people compared to other communities during the Civil War and even before the Civil War. And so they too are afraid, and they have a memory of history, etc. And so Kurds in the north had history of persecution. Sunnah had a history of persecution. Druzis have had a history of persecution. How did they end up where they are? And the Alawis fearful of the future. In that climate of fear, which I saw something similar in Iraq, it's very hard to overcome that and build trust if you don't have people held accountable when they commit human rights violations, and in particular, extrajudicial killing and kidnappings. And let us be honest, this has happened at the hands of government security forces. This has happened up in the Northeast in the autonomous administration in places like Raqqa. And there are instances where it happened in Soweto too. Government security forces, absolutely. But some incidents as well of the Soweto Military Council where they shelled a particular village. There's a reason that the Bedouin families got on buses to be evacuated. They were afraid. Why? There'd already been some people killed. So if no one is ever held accountable, the lesson from Iraq that I take is if no one is ever held accountable, you will have politics marked by fear instead of trust. And it's very hard to build stability in that case. There has to be trust. You have trust with dialogue, and when people say, we will respect your rights, if there's no accountability, the promise has no credibility. Have to have some accountability.
I'll try to finish with some question about the some things need explaining maybe for me. Can you understand what the Israelis want from Syria? Because once the Assad regime fell, before that they didn't strike Syria. They did, but specifically Iranian or Hezbollah, but they didn't claim that they were providing any aid to civilians during the 13, 14 years of war in Syria. Suddenly they bombed all of the military of the new regime that they don't know yet how it will behave. And then they claim that they want to protect civilians, Druze or Kurds. Or what. How do you understand this policy?
Well, I'm not Israeli, and I never worked in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, so I'm not an expert on their politics. But I do think that October 7th, the terrorist attack, was a gigantic shock to Israel, both the population and the government. And I think in the aftermath of that attack, their mentality has changed to, we will do anything necessary to stop a risk to our people. It reminds me a little bit of the Americans after 9/11, and which was a justification for invading Iraq, by the way. So I understand it in that sense, that the Israelis have shifted to a policy that is more aggressive, which they justify to themselves as being necessary for their own protection. Now, it's a different question, Judd. Is that policy effective? is it going to achieve what they want? That's a different question.
No, my question would
But
be...
the mentality that explains the policy, I think, is there.
My question would be that one can understand that if the U.S. got traumatized from 9/11, even though the reaction would be killing a million people elsewhere just to treat their trauma. Okay, one cannot justify it, but one can understand that it's the U.S. who can say no. When I see Israel, it's not a superpower, it's not an international superpower, Israel, and it kills 65,000 in Gaza and wants to now, how to say, ضم الضفة, and then bomb Lebanon, bomb Syria, bomb Qatar, bomb
Yemen, bomb Tunisia.
But Israel is not a superpower. How come no one in this international community can just put a break on this?
Okay, so it's time for Saraha Raha.
Yeah.
Israel maybe is not an international superpower, but Israel is a superpower in the region, in the Middle East. Iran cannot threaten Israel seriously. Egypt, no. Jordan, no. United Arab Emirates, no. Saudi Arabia, no. So there is Turkey. All I know is the Turks are being very careful to avoid conflict with Israel in Syria. Turks have not, for example, put their aircraft at air bases in central Syria, even though they were talking about doing that early in the year. Turks are treating Israel very carefully. Israel is, in the region, a superpower. How is this possible? Well, it's possible largely because of military support from the United States government. Is there any move in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration to restrain Israel? No, not really. So as long as that support from Washington is there, the Israelis don't need to change. It's a different question, Judd, to ask, what is Washington waiting for? And we can talk about that. But right now, and dating from October 8th, the Americans, Democratic White House, Republican White House, have not pressed Israel to stop. And the result is we see the genocide, we see strikes on all the other capitals. The Americans have a negotiating session arranged with Iran to discuss the nuclear program. Would the negotiations succeed? Allahu alam, we don't know. Probably not. But in any case, you've scheduled a negotiating session. The Israelis bomb immediately before that round of negotiations, hurting American credibility and infuriating the Iranians, and then the Americans end up having to join the attack because the Israelis cannot do all of their mission by themselves. So, and now here we are. That strike was in June. Now we're in September. 3 months later, we still don't have negotiations with Iran about where we're going. I see now there's even discussion of new military strikes on Iran. So,
But how can you explain the total disregard in the U.S. administration for some sort of consistency when they have a strong position on land infringement in Ukraine by the Russians, but when the Israelis strike 6 countries in another region, they just go along?
Well, if you're asking for consistency in politics, I think you will always be disappointed.
No, I'm asking for consistency not towards us in the region, but towards the electorate here in the U.S. How does an administration explain itself?
So there's a
change.
There's a large and important segment of the American public that will defend what Israel does, no matter what it does. And it's not only Jews. That's important for people in the region to understand. It's not only Jews. Some Jews, not all Jews, do support Israel no matter what it does. Some Jews are very critical here in the United States of what Israel does. There's also a large conservative Christian element. The man who was just terribly murdered in Utah a couple of days ago, Charlie Kirk, was a big defender of Israel. And he's not Jewish. He's conservative Christian. So
Michael Huckabee, the ambassador.
And Michael is a very good example. So as long as those people are influential in government, the government in Jerusalem can essentially do whatever it wants. And there will never be an American effort to restrain them. The only way I can see that American policy changes is if there's a dramatic shift in the top leadership.
In the top leadership or in the mechanism of decision-making, if money and
No,
politics
top leadership. Well, the top leadership may not take, I want to put this a different way. The top leadership may not care as much about the conservative Christians and those other elements that support Israel. Their political base may be different. Opinion polls are very clearly showing now in the United States, not just one poll, many polls are showing that younger Americans, especially from the Democratic Party, but increasingly from the Republican Party, are not as supportive of Israel as they used to be. And in fact, most young people from the Democratic Party now say they are pro-Palestinian, not pro-Israel. There was a poll, a New York Times Siena poll just last week that showed that the majority of New Yorkers think that Israel has gone too far in Gaza. And of course, there's a big Jewish population in New York.
It's the second city in the world.
So, and this is what I'm saying. Not all Jews in the United States support what Israel is doing. I mean, there have been a lot of the protesters at the colleges who are Jewish students. So we can't, it's important to distinguish between what Israel does and what American Jews think, because there's not a unity. But there are organizations like AIPAC, like the the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, that strongly support Israel. That exists. And they have, we have to say, they have influence in Washington. But a new leadership might have a different political base and might therefore have different policies. Here in Maine, where I live, we have a candidate who's going to run for Senate, and he was an Army veteran. He served in Iraq, 3 different assignments in Iraq. He served 1 assignment in Afghanistan. He says the Americans need to get out of the wars in the Middle East, stay out, and stop giving aid to Israel, and use the money that now goes to Israel, use it for domestic needs here in the United States, education, healthcare, whatever it is. Stop giving the money to Israel and focus the money on people that need it in the United States. And he's also come out and criticized Israel on Gaza. If he wins and people like him, you could see a change.
I don't know how many Americans know the weight of their votes, because they change the lives of people in other regions in the world.
But most Americans don't vote because of the Middle East. Most Americans are voting about the economy, number 1. And then they'll vote number 2 on social issues, maybe. But the economy is always the big issue here, not foreign policy.
So, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time.
More than you wanted, yeah, Judd.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.